Hello and welcome to another bikepacking Q&A video. In this video we are going to answer a cracking question I got in from Paul about different sleeping options while you're bikepacking. But just before we dive into the video, please consider subscribing, give this video a thumbs up, and if you have a question that you want to get answered in an upcoming video, you can either head to my website and leave a voicemail on there, or leave a comment on this video and you may hear it answered in an upcoming video. So in this video we're going to look at these three sleeping options, the tent, the hammock and the bivvy bag, and we're going to look at the pros and cons of each. And then at the end of the video we're going to talk about other sleeping options you could consider when you're out on your bikepacking trips. Oh, and by the way, this video isn't sponsored in any way, but if you want to find out what gear I use, I have a list of every single product I use on a regular basis on my website. So just click through to that and you can see about these products in a bit more detail. Right, let's start with the bivvy bag. This is the simplest form of shelter out there. Looking at the pros, there are a few really. Number one is that it's super lightweight and super easy to compact down. So if you're wanting to keep your gear to a minimal, or if you're wanting to be quite lightweight, maybe you're trekking across the mountains or something like that, a bivvy bag is great for that. Another pro is that it's very discreet. So if you're wanting to set up stealthily, or maybe you're in a country where you're not supposed to wild camp, then this is a really good option because it's very inconspicuous. No one's going to see you. You can hide behind a wall or in a bush somewhere and no one's going to know that you're there. So that's another great thing about the bivvy bag. Another thing to think about is they're actually reasonably cheap. They're not cheap, but compared to things like tents and more expensive hammocks and things, they are one of the cheapest forms of shelter out there. So if you're on a budget, a bivvy bag is a great option. And one final pro of the bivvy bag is that you're exposed to the elements, which can also be quite a major con, which we'll talk about. But if the weather's nice and you're lying on your back looking up at the stars, that is breathtaking. You don't get that if you're sleeping in a tent. It will lead us on to the first con of a bivvy bag, is that you're exposed to the elements. So if you're in a country like England or Scotland or wherever that's freezing cold and it rains quite a lot, a bivvy bag doesn't tend to be the best option in that case because your face is on show. You can get bivvy bags with a hoop and a hood. I don't go down that route purely because it almost feels like you're in a very compact tent if you're in one of those, and if that's what you're after, why don't you just get a tent and you get more space out of that? Some people use a tarp, which you can lay across your bivvy bag, and that stops the rain from hitting you. And again, that packs down very small like a bivvy bag, so that's another option as well. But it's not something that I do, because the great thing about a bivvy bag, as we talked about before, is that it's very discreet. And if you then have to go somewhere where you need supports to tie a tarp to, it starts to kind of defeat the point of a bivvy bag, in my opinion. The biggest con of a bivvy bag, in my opinion, is that they're a bugger to get in and out of. Once you're in, you better be ready for bed because you're not going to be able to get back out again easily, and then you've got to fight your way back in again. So on many occasions I've woken up in the middle of the night, desperate for a wee. It takes me about 2 or 3 minutes to get out of it, and then I've got to stumble back in the dark and try and fight my way back into the bivvy bag. It's really difficult. It's almost like putting on clothes while lying down, and if you think about it, you need to be upright to be able to put your clothes on, because every time you're putting your weight on something you can't pull it or move it. So it's a bit of a challenge to get in and out of. Once you've mastered that knack, it's not too bad, but it's just something to bear in mind. If you want easy access, or if you're the sort of person who wakes up a lot in the night needing to go to the toilet, it's not going to be a good option for you, I'm afraid. Another thing that you can't do in a bivvy bag is sit up, which may not sound like a big deal. If you want somewhere where you can get changed in the morning discreetly, you can't do that in the bivvy bag. If you like to be able to sit and have a cup of tea or some breakfast in a shelter that you can sit up in, you can't do that with a bivvy bag, so it's another thing to think about. Right, moving on to the tent. This is probably the most common form of bikepacking shelter, and it's probably my go-to as well. 9 times out of 10 I will take a tent with me on my bikepacking trips. So, starting with the pros. Number one, it will protect you from all the elements. Unlike the bivvy bag and the hammock, which we'll come to, this is fantastic when it's raining, snowing, or if it's incredibly windy, because it's naturally got that cover over it. You're in your own little bubble and you've kind of got a little microclimate in there which helps keep you warm. So it's brilliant for that. I've slept in this tent in all weather conditions. I've slept in it at -6 in the Highlands of Scotland in winter, and it does a very good job of keeping out the elements and keeping you warm. Another great thing about having a tent is that you can store stuff inside it. So if you've been out cycling all day and you've got really wet clothes, for example, you can hang them inside the tent and your body heat will help dry that overnight. You can also keep things secure, like camera equipment. For me, I put that underneath here so it stops it from getting wet in the middle of the night. It's not in with me in the tent, but it's underneath the canopy, so I know that it's not going to get ruined. Also, if you're somewhere where you want to be able to nip out and do something, you can put all your stuff inside the tent and you can kind of use that as a bit of a storage option. Obviously, it's not the most secure, but it gives you that option rather than just leaving things strewn around your bivvy bag. And the final pro, really, of having a tent is that it's probably the warmest shelter, because when you're in it, your body heat forms a little microclimate inside the tent and the wind isn't blowing that heat away. It means that you can be relatively warm when, if you were in a bivvy bag or a hammock, you might get a little bit chilly. Right, moving on to the cons, and there's only a few, but the first one is that it's super expensive. If you're buying a good bike packing tent or a backpacking tent versus a hammock or a bivvy bag, it is significantly more expensive. By far and away, this is the most expensive shelter that I own. The reason for that is it's very lightweight and the materials they use tend to be reasonably expensive as well. And there's a lot of design that goes into tents like this to keep them lightweight with minimal materials. So as a result, they do tend to cost quite a lot. But the way I see it, once you've got one, if you look after it, it's going to last you probably a lifetime. So, you know, although it's expensive, it might be a good investment. Number two, the tent is not very discreet. It's very conspicuous, in fact. If you're trying to keep a low profile and then you erect a bright green neon tent, it's going to be pretty obvious that you're camping there. So if you're someone who likes to be stealthy, the tent's probably not the best way to go for that. And the final con really is that even if you buy the lightest bike packing tent on the market, it's still going to be heavier than these other two items. So if you're trying to keep weight to a minimum, then again, the tent is probably not the best option. And finally, we're moving on to the hammock. This is probably often overlooked really as a bike packing shelter, and I don't really know why. It's got some fantastic benefits and it opens up different sleeping options that you don't get with the tent or the bivvy bag. Looking at the pros then, number one, by far and away, this shelter is the most comfortable of the three. If you've ever slept on a hard ground in a tent or a bivvy bag, you'll know the next morning you'll feel pretty rubbish and you won't have slept very well. Naturally, the hammock feels a lot lighter than that because you're floating in the air, which is just naturally going to be more comfortable than laying on a hard ground. The second pro is that it actually packs down really, really small. Even with the straps, like I've invested in some super heavy duty straps, even with those and the hammock packs down really small, it's still much smaller than a tent, slightly bigger than a bivvy bag, but still super compact. So if you're one of those people who's trying to keep your gear down to a minimum, this could be a really good option for you. I mentioned hammocks open up different sleeping options for you that you can't get with a tent or a bivvy bag, and that's absolutely true. If you ever find yourself in a location where the ground is incredibly uneven or rocky or just not comfortable to sleep on, or the gradients are incredibly steep and you just can't set up a tent there, a hammock is a great option because it's always going to be level. So as long as you've got trees to tie it to, you can sleep in the hammock and you'll be laying on a level surface regardless of what's underneath you. So that's a really good option. If you're going somewhere that's a little bit more challenging, you've got that option of sleeping pretty much on any terrain. That leads me nicely onto the cons, and the first con really is this shelter is pretty useless unless you've got something to tie it to. So if you're going to the desert or some farmland where there just aren't any trees or any lampposts or anything to tie it to, you're going to end up just sleeping on the floor in a blanket, which is pretty rubbish. So if you are planning on hammocking, make sure you've done your research. I know it sounds stupid, but make sure that where you're going actually has options for you to set it up. Otherwise, you'll be very cold and very uncomfortable. Funnily enough, the fact that you have to set up a hammock normally in the woodland can present problems. I found out quite recently, to my detriment, that when I went up to Scotland in the summer, the midges seem to like to hang out in the woods, and if you're forced to set up there, you end up getting eaten alive. And elsewhere in the world, you might find something even more serious like bears. So it's just something to think about. The fact that you have to set up in the woodland means you probably need to be a little bit more prepared for nature and other things that might like to eat you. And the last con really is a bit like the bivvy bag. You're exposed to the elements. So if it starts raining, you will get wet. So if you want to prevent that from happening, you can always bring a tarp, a bit like the bivvy bag, to hang over the trees and keep the rain off you. Just as a side note, something that people don't often think about when they get a hammock is that it tends to get really cold from underneath because the wind blows up there, and because you've not got a mat or anything to protect you, to insulate you, you end up with a really cold back, but the rest of you seems to get really warm. So a way to combat that is to get a blanket or some form of insulated mat to put in the hammock. And finally, let's look at a couple of other accommodation options you can consider. Because of these films, I rarely camp for more than one night on the trot. The reason for that is, although I have spare batteries and battery packs, I do need to charge my electronics. Things like the drone, for example, won't charge from a battery pack. They need to be charged from the mains. So there's only so many days I can go without running out of power. So things I use for that, I tend to just use booking.com to find B&Bs or hotels on the route. The reason I do that is when I'm planning these routes, which I'll probably do another video on, to be honest, I look for accommodation that's on the route or is basically somewhere that's a reasonable stop-off point to where I'm going. So I'll plan the route and then I'll look and think, oh, how many miles can I do that day without feeling exhausted? Let's say 50. I'll look at 50 miles point and then see what sort of villages are there around there. Look on booking.com and try and book something for that. You just need to check in the Q&A section of the property whether or not they've got somewhere to store your bike. Usually people are quite accommodating, but it's worth just asking before you go, or checking the Q&A because someone might have already asked it. Although that can get quite expensive sometimes, if you book further enough in advance, or if you've got reward schemes like the Booking.com have their own genius reward scheme, things like cashback credit cards, all kinds of things like that, you can start to recoup some of that money. But for me, it's an essential thing. And actually, it is quite nice to do sometimes, because although camping is a great experience, sometimes it's nice to have a proper wash and sleep in a warm bed and have a cooked breakfast. And I find that that also adds a great experience to the trip. Another form of accommodation to talk about, especially here in the UK, that I've used a few times now, are bothies. Now, a bothy tends to be an old building that's been converted to an emergency shelter. It could be an old farmer's building, it could be an old storage facility. There's all kinds of things that have been converted into bothies. Some great things about bothies is that usually they are free. However, they are run by volunteers typically, so make sure you give a donation to the charity that looks after those, because if we don't look after them, they will be gone forever, and they're a great thing to have here. As well as that, you will likely meet other people. So if you like the experience of meeting new people on your adventures, getting to know people, and just generally having a bit more of a social experience, then bothies can be great for that. They are fairly basic. They do tend to just be stone buildings with a stove if you're lucky, so you can keep it warm, and usually bunk beds that's just wooden beds, so make sure that you've got some sleeping equipment with you as well. Just a quick top tip on bothies. They are really great, but make sure that you have extra sleeping stuff with you just in case. Me and my dad went bikepacking to Galloway Forest Park in the spring, and when we got to the bothy we were planning on sleeping at, it was completely full, and there were other people I knew that were on their way there because we'd just seen them. So thankfully we had tents, but if you don't bring that, you will likely find, if it's busy, that you'll be caught out. So just a top tip, make sure that you bring that spare sleeping stuff with you, and you can always camp around the bothy, that's absolutely fine, but just make sure you're aware of that. Right, I hope you found that video useful. If you did, give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing. And if you've got any more questions that you want me to answer on an upcoming Q&A series video, leave them in the comments or leave a voicemail on my website. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.